My name is Sarah Burns, and I am inspired to tell a story of this place through my art. I first encountered Vesper Meadow in early 2019 when I was looking for a place to bring landscape painting students. And I immediately became immersed in its history and mission. So currently spanning about 1,000 acres in the Southern Oregon Cascades, Vesper Meadow Restoration Preserve consists of 2 meadows, some forest land, and an 80-acre clear cut where restoration work has begun there as well. Native seeds and shrubs have been planted, getting that process started. The meadow and forests are home to a diverse array of wildlife, including an elk herd, sandhill crane, a rare tumbleweed lichen, and many, many more species, including the imperiled species of the Mardon skipper butterfly and the Vesper sparrow, for which the meadow gets its name. Before the restoration work began, the main meadow had been significantly impacted by out-of-date ranching practices common to the last century. Willows and shrubs were removed from the banks of the creek to allow cattle easy access to the water. This caused the water to move through the creeks too quickly, eroding the soil and impacting the habitat of the entire meadow, exacerbating drought conditions and creating problems for wildlife. I was really impacted by what I was learning and seeing. The natural world and our human interaction with it is a major source of inspiration for my work. The more I learn about a place, the more invested I am in painting it. I learned that scientists use numbered posts called station points, where they regularly take photographs to track the progress of the restoration work. So I decided to do something similar with paintings. Using my traditional European approach to plein air landscape, I return to the same place at Vesper Meadow each summer in June or July, and I've been doing this for 6 years and counting, painting a curve along Latgawa Creek called Bovine Beach. My annual paintings show the continued development of this place, illustrating the natural and human influence changes in the landscape from year to year. I'm surprised that they tell an interesting story already. I thought it was going to take 10 years or more to see any variety. (2019) year 1. This was a wet year. It was very green in June when I made this painting, and you can see here the creek's very open with lots of exposed soil and water. 2020. This is the same curve of the creek, but I've moved in closer this time to paint some beautiful blooming yarrow. 2021. This was a very dry year, the worst drought in a long time. The meadow was already dry and there was smoke in the air from an early wildfire in the region. Very little water flowed in the creek, but you can see the grass is growing nicely throughout the whole creek bed. 2022. This year I made a larger painting because I wanted to show a bit more context. You can also see the plants growing in the creek are getting a little bit taller. The banks are changing too. They're becoming a little shallower, which means there's more opportunity for gentle flooding of the meadow if there's ever enough water. In 2023, Vesper Meadow staff and volunteers installed post-assisted log structures known as PALs at this bend in the river and all throughout the meadow. My painting this year is a testament to the improvement of the creek bed and the banks. Pals mimic the work of beavers. They slow down the water, causing sediment to gather, which nourishes the plants and causes the creek to flood more widely. This feeds the camas and other meadow plants and flowers. So this is the first time in many years that the water reached the meadow. Very exciting. And I intentionally made this painting kind of on the same scale and the same vantage point as the previous year, just so you can see before the pals, after the pals. So for 2024, I painted this in the evening, turning slightly to the southwest to focus on the willows. It gets so hot in July, and out in the meadow, there is no shade. So I decided to set up to paint as the sun was getting low in the sky when it was a bit cooler. Looking at this painting makes me recall the sound of the red-winged blackbird and the bubbling creek, and truly I just viscerally remember how good it felt to be there painting. And it reminds me how important it is to make time to be outdoors in nature. As of this filming, I have not made my 2025 painting yet, but the big news is, this year in March, Vesper Meadow welcomed a beaver family. I am so excited to see how the beavers take over the restoration work because they are the true experts for creek restoration. During the past 6 years, my relationship with Vesper Meadow has deepened and grown. I've learned how easy and important it is to cultivate native plants that support wildlife. And so I've actually transformed my suburban yard and flower garden into a native plant meadow, and I've become obsessed with it. I have over 40 native plants now growing in my yard. So this experience has really changed me, and I look forward to being part of this place for the rest of my life, for as many years as I can. And I hope that these paintings, that this exhibit that we've put together, gives you a sense of this place that I have grown to love. And I hope it inspires within you a desire to create deeper relationships with your favorite places too. So thank you for being here today, and once you're done, make sure to get outside and enjoy some nature.